On the evening of October 2nd, 2006, 3 Amish men left their farms and walked to a house a few miles away. It had been the worst day their quiet corner of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania had ever seen. That morning, a man had walked into their children's schoolhouse and done something that would leave 5 families grieving and shake the entire country. And the house these 3 men were walking toward was his. It belonged to the family of the man responsible. These 3 men had come to sit with his widow, to tell her, to her face, that they forgave her husband and that they would grieve right alongside her. That same evening, before the funerals, before they had even laid their own daughters to rest, the rest of the world could not understand it. Within a week, more than 2,400 news stories tried to explain how the parents of those girls could forgive that fast, and most of them landed on the same word: miracle. But it wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't shock, and it wasn't a performance for the cameras. What the Amish did in Nickel Mines was something they had been practicing their entire lives, built so deep into the way they live that one of them would later say it was never really a choice at all. By the end of this, you are going to understand exactly how it works and why it might be the most misunderstood thing about the Amish. It had started as an ordinary Monday. At the West Nickel Mines School, a one-room Amish schoolhouse surrounded by farmland in Bart Township, about 24 kids were doing what they did every morning, reading and reciting and waiting on recess. This was old-order Amish country, the kind of place where families still farm with horses, still light their homes with oil lamps, and still keep the modern world at arm's length on purpose. Nickel Mines wasn't even really a town, just a crossroads of farms southeast of the city of Lancaster. The schoolhouse had no computers and no phone on the wall. It was about as far from the violence of the outside world as any place in America gets. A little after 10, a pickup pulled up outside, and a man they knew walked in. He was 32, he wasn't Amish, and he drove the milk tanker that served the local farms. His name was Charles Carl Roberts IV. What happened over the next hour is the hardest part of this story, and I'm going to handle it the way the Amish themselves would, gently, without dwelling on it. He sent the boys and the adults out of the room, and by the time the state police arrived, 5 of the girls had lost their lives, and he had taken his own. The oldest was 13, the youngest was 7. That is as far into that hour as we need to go. Everything that matters here is what the people of Nickel Mines did next. But before we get to what they did, you should know who they were doing it for. Because these weren't statistics, they were 5 little girls with names. Naomi Rose Ebersole was 7. Mary Liz Miller was 8, and Lena Miller was 7, and the 2 of them were sisters, which means one family lost both of their daughters in the same room on the same morning. Anna Mae Stoltzfus was 12, and the oldest was a 13-year-old named Marion Fisher. Marion is the one people who study this story keep coming back to because of something she did in the middle of the worst moment imaginable. When it became clear what was about to happen, Marion didn't beg for herself. She stepped forward and asked the man to take her first and to let the younger ones go. Her little sister, who was 11 and in that room with her, asked for the same thing. Think about what that takes. A 13-year-old doing the math on a horror no child should ever have to understand and spending the arithmetic on the girls smaller than her. She didn't survive that day. Her sister did. And that instinct to absorb the worst so someone else is spared is going to echo through everything the adults in this community did in the hours and years that followed. The children showed them how before they ever had to show the world. Now. That same evening, while the whole country was watching news helicopters circle a cornfield, the Amish were already doing the thing nobody expected. Before the sun went down, 3 Amish men set out to find the gunman's widow. Her name was Marie, and she wasn't Amish either. She was a young mother of 3 who had woken up that morning, married to a milk truck driver, and gone to bed the most hated woman in America through no fault of her own. The 3 men tracked her down at her parents' house, and they did not come to accuse her. They came to grieve with her and to tell her plainly that they held nothing against her or her children. A few miles away, another Amish neighbor went to the home of the gunman's mother and father. The father was so broken he could barely stand, and this neighbor, a man who had known the family for years, simply put his arms around him and held him. Not for a minute or two, for about an hour. He just stood there in that yard and held a grieving father while the man wept. Someone in the community put the whole thing into words that would get repeated around the world. Speaking to Marie, an Amish delegation told her, "We have forgiven your husband, and we share in your sorrow." And then they told her something even harder to believe. They told her to stay in her home, in that community, and not to run. "You are one of us now," was the message. "Your grief is our grief." That was the offer, made on the same day, by people whose own children were not yet buried. And it wasn't only words. A few days later, at the funeral for one of the murdered girls, a grandfather stood with the younger children gathered around a small grave. These were kids old enough to be angry, old enough to want someone to blame. And this grandfather looked at them and said, "We shouldn't think evil of the man who did this. He too is a child of God." This was the hardest thing a grieving grandfather can do. He was making sure the hatred stopped with him, instead of getting passed down to the children standing right there in front of him. Then came the funerals, and this is where the outside world really started to struggle. The 5 girls were laid to rest on October 5th and 6th in plain wooden coffins in a small Amish cemetery, the way the Amish have buried their dead for centuries. And then, on October 7th, the gunman was buried too. His family expected almost no one. They expected to bury him quietly, in shame, alone. Instead, when they arrived at the graveside, they watched as Amish people began to appear from around the edge of the cemetery. As many as 40 of them came. Out of roughly 75 people at that burial, about half were Amish. And some of them were the very families who had buried their own little girls a day or two before. Sit with that for a second. A mother and father who had just lowered their own daughter into the ground, standing in the rain at the grave of the man who put her there, so that his widow and his children would not have to stand there alone. The funeral director who handled the arrangements said afterward that he knew he was witnessing something he'd never seen in his career. He said, "I knew I was witnessing a miracle, and the forgiveness didn't stop at showing up. It cost them money, on purpose." After the shooting, donations poured in from all over the world. People wanted to help these families, and the Amish set up a group called the Nickel Mines Accountability Committee to handle it responsibly. In the end, that fund grew to more than $4.3 million. Most of it went where you'd expect, toward the staggering medical bills for the girls who survived. But the committee did something with part of that money that made headlines all over again. They set a portion of it aside in a trust fund for the gunman's own 3 children. Read that back. The community he devastated made sure his kids would be taken care of. When people asked the committee how on earth they could do that, the answer they gave was almost startling in how practical it was. They said that holding on to hatred doesn't punish the person who hurt you. It just hollows you out. Their goal, they said, was to make sure that none of them became, in their words, a hostage to hostility. To them, forgiveness had almost nothing to do with the gunman himself. He was already gone. It was about keeping their own hearts from being poisoned by what he'd done. And this fit a pattern that goes back generations. The Amish, as a rule, don't sue, and they often refuse the kind of wrongful death settlements most families would fight for in court. To them, turning a death into a payout or a lawsuit into a weapon would only keep them chained to the person who hurt them. Giving up the money was one more way of loosening that grip, because most of the news coverage missed what was really going on underneath it. For about a week, this was the biggest story in the world. Those 2,400 news stories weren't really about a crime anymore. They were about the forgiveness. Reporters flew in from other countries. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. How? How do you do this? And a lot of the coverage settled for calling it a miracle and leaving it there, because a miracle is easy. A miracle doesn't require you to change anything about your own life. It's just something that happened to unusually good people somewhere in Pennsylvania. 3 scholars who spent years actually interviewing these families weren't satisfied with that answer. One of them, Donald Craybill, a professor at nearby Elizabethtown College, sat down with dozens of Amish families and wrote what became the definitive account of all of it, a book called Amish Grace. how forgiveness transcended tragedy. And what he and his co-authors found is that the word actually gets it wrong. The forgiveness really was extraordinary. It just wasn't an accident. It had a source, and once you see it, the whole thing makes a different kind of sense. Now, I want to be honest with you, because the real story here is messier than the fairy tale version, and better for it. Not everyone applauded. Underneath all the praise, there was a real backlash, and it came from thoughtful people. Some critics argued the forgiveness came too fast, that you can't possibly forgive something like this within hours and mean it, that what looked like grace might really be a community suppressing its own rage in a way that isn't healthy. Others worried about something deeper. They asked whether rushing to forgive lets evil off the hook. If you forgive this quickly, are you saying it didn't matter? Are you skipping past justice, past anger, past the long hard work grief is supposed to be? And these weren't fringe voices. A well-known Boston Globe columnist named Jeff Jacoby wrote that the Amish response, however moving, risked treating a monstrous act too lightly, and that maybe some things should not be forgiven quite so easily. Another writer ran a column asking, essentially, why the Amish were ignoring reality. And a number of psychologists made a quieter point that's harder to wave off. Forgiveness offered too fast, they argued, can sometimes be a way of avoiding pain instead of facing it, even a kind of self-erasure. If anyone has ever told you to just let something go before you were ready to, you know the exact nerve they were touching. Those are fair questions, and the Amish would not dodge them. And the answer to them is the whole reason this story is worth understanding, because it turns out the Amish means something very specific by the word forgiveness, and it's not what most of us mean by it. If you're the kind of person who wants the real story underneath the headline, and not just the headline, go ahead and subscribe, because the part that actually explains all of this is coming up right now. So, how does it actually work? It starts with a prayer. If you grow up Amish, one of the very first things you learn, before you can even read, is the Lord's Prayer. And there's a line in it that most people say on autopilot. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. An Amish person prays that line at home and in church, out loud and under their breath, as many as 8 times in a single day, every day, for their entire life. Now think about what that line is actually saying. It ties God's forgiveness of you directly to your forgiveness of other people. It's a two-way deal. And this is the piece that flips the whole thing around. In most Christian teaching, you forgive other people because God forgave you first. The Amish flip that around. They believe you receive God's forgiveness by extending it to others in the first place. Refusing to forgive isn't just unkind in their theology. It puts your own soul in danger, and it goes deeper than one prayer. In the Amish church, ministers preach a particular story from the Bible before their communion services, the parable of the unforgiving servant. It's about a man who is forgiven an enormous debt by his king, and then turns around and throttles someone who owes him a little bit of money and is condemned for it. And the timing is the part that stops you cold. Amish families in the Nickel Mines area would have sat in church and heard that exact parable about the duty to forgive on Sunday, October 1st, the day before the shooting. They didn't have to go looking for the answer to how they should respond. They had heard it less than 24 hours earlier. But even that isn't the full picture, because if forgiveness were just a feeling, no one could summon it that fast over something that terrible. And this is the part people miss most. For the Amish, forgiveness is a discipline. It's a decision you make and then keep making, day after day, whether or not your heart has caught up yet. There's an old Amish concept at the center of their whole way of life. In their dialect, it's called Gelassenheit, and it roughly means yieldedness, or letting go. Giving up your own will, your own claim to be right, your own right to strike back, and surrendering it to God and to the community. You practice it like a muscle, every single day, in 1,000 small ways, long before a day like October 2nd ever tests it. So when the Amish say they forgave the gunman that same evening, they are not claiming they woke up the next morning without pain. That's the misunderstanding at the heart of the whole story. The scholars who studied this are careful to draw a line between two things we usually blur together. There's forgiveness, which they describe as letting go of the right to revenge, trading hatred for something else. And then there's pardon, which is releasing someone from the consequences of what they did. The Amish offered forgiveness. Pardon, the releasing of a person from the consequences of what they did, was never theirs to give, and they never pretended otherwise. In fact, they generally have no problem with the courts handing out consequences. And there's one more piece that trips people up. Amish forgiveness doesn't wait for an apology. The man was gone. He could never say he was sorry, never explain himself, never make any of it right. For most of us, that alone would make forgiveness impossible, because deep down, we treat forgiveness as something a person has to earn first. The Amish don't. Their forgiveness is unconditional. It doesn't hinge on the other person deserving it, or asking for it, or even being alive to hear it. That's exactly what freed them to offer it on the very same day. Forgiveness, for them, doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen, and it absolutely doesn't mean they stopped grieving. They are not a cold people. They wept at those funerals like anyone would. They forgave and they grieved at the same time, and they'd tell you those two things were never in conflict, which finally answers the question everyone was really asking. Why so fast? It was fast because, for them, it worked like a reflex. You cannot conjure that kind of response in an afternoon if you've never practiced it. But if you've spent your whole life forgiving the small things, the slight from a neighbor, the argument with a brother, the daily friction of living in a tight community where you can't just move away from someone you're angry at, then the machinery is already built. When the unthinkable came, they didn't have to construct a response from scratch. They ran the same track they'd been running since childhood, just under an unimaginable weight. One of the scholars put it simply. He said this is built into their cultural DNA. They have a 300, 400-year history of responding to wrong exactly this way. The Amish had quietly forgiven killings before, for generations. Nickel Mines was just the first time the whole world happened to be watching. And that history isn't some abstraction to them. It has a face and a name. Nearly every Amish home keeps a thick, old book called The Martyr's Mirror, first printed right here in Pennsylvania back in 1748, filled with the stories of their ancestors who were tortured and killed for their faith in Europe. Amish children grow up on those accounts the way other kids grow up on fairy tales, roughly 2,500 of them, and the one they treasure most is about a man named Dirk Willems. In the winter of 1569, in Holland, Dirk was running for his life across a frozen pond, chased by a man sent to arrest him and put him to death. Halfway across, his pursuer broke through the ice and started to go under, and Dirk stopped. He turned around, walked back, and pulled the very man hunting him out of the freezing water, saving his life. He was seized on the spot and executed a few months later. For more than 300 years, that image, a hunted man turning back to rescue his enemy, has been the Amish picture of what it actually looks like to love the person who wants to destroy you. So when this community turned back toward the Roberts family, they were doing the same thing Dirk did on the ice, 4.5 centuries later. And here's where I want to leave you with the part of this story that almost never gets told, the part that happens after the cameras leave. Because if the forgiveness had just been a beautiful gesture on a terrible week, it would be a nice story and nothing more. What makes it real is that it lasted for the next 18 years. The most gravely hurt of the surviving girls was a 6-year-old named Rosanna King. Her injuries left her unable to walk, to speak, or to eat on her own. She would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair, cared for around the clock by her family, who never once treated her as anything less than a beloved daughter. And here is the detail that I think says more about forgiveness than any sermon ever could. Every Thursday, for years, a woman would drive out to the King family's farmhouse to help care for Rosanna. She would read to her from the Bible and from Anne of Green Gables. She would sing to her. She would help bathe her and tuck her into bed. That woman was Terry Roberts, the gunman's mother. To understand how she ended up there, you have to go back to the days right after it happened, when she and her husband were bracing to be hated for the rest of their lives. At their son's small private burial, they looked up and saw Amish neighbors walking toward them across the cemetery to stand with them at the grave. And the ones who reached them first, Terry would later say, were the parents who had lost not one, but 2 little girls that morning, the same mother and father, coming over to comfort her. It broke something open in her. If people who had lost that much could still cross a graveyard to put their arms around her, she asked herself, then was there anything in this life that should not be forgiven? That question is what sent her back, every Thursday for years, to sit with Rosanna. Let that settle. The mother of the man responsible spent her Thursdays lovingly caring for one of the girls he had hurt most, in the home of the family he had shattered, and that family welcomed her in and made her part of their lives. Terry said the Amish taught her how to carry it. She once recalled an Amish mother telling her that she, Terry, was suffering even more than they were, and she could hardly believe a grieving parent would say such a thing to her. Terry kept those Thursday visits until she died of cancer in 2017, and Rosanna, the little girl she read to, lived until 2024, when she passed away at home at the age of 23, 18 years after that morning, surrounded by the family that loved her. I don't want to hand you a tidy ending, because the people who lived this wouldn't. Years later, one of the fathers who lost a daughter admitted, honestly, that there were still days he asked himself whether he had truly forgiven, whether it had really taken. That doubt is the truest thing in the whole story. Forgiveness, the way the Amish practice it, didn't end when the news cameras left. They had to keep choosing it, again and again, for the rest of their lives. So when you hear that the Amish forgave the man responsible for Nickel Mines, understand what they actually did and what they didn't. They didn't forget. They didn't pretend it was okay. They didn't skip their grief, and they didn't spare the man any judgment beyond this life. What they did was refuse. They refused to let the worst thing that ever happened to them turn them into something bitter and small. They refused to hand their children a legacy of hatred. They refused, in their own words, to become hostages to hostility. And they decided that a man's family should not be buried under his crime. That's the thing the headlines never quite captured. From the outside, what the Amish did can look like weakness. Standing in a graveyard and choosing not to hate is one of the hardest things a person will ever be asked to do. And it's just one piece of a much larger way of living and dying that sets the Amish completely apart from the rest of us. Because the way they handle grief is only the beginning. The way they handle death itself, the funeral, the burial, the whole final goodbye, is just as radically different, and it's where we're going next.